On a chilling October evening, under a cloud-filled sky, the silhouette of Blackwood Manor loomed like a silent sentinel against the darkening world. Once a testament to Victorian grandeur, the mansion now sagged with the weight of years and neglect, its grand architecture diminished by time and decay. The sprawling grounds, long untended, had surrendered to the wild grip of nature. Twisted iron gates creaked in the wind, their rusted forms a far cry from the elegance they once promised. Faded cherubs, chipped and cracked, still clung to their stone posts, frozen in time as though the statues themselves could feel the sorrow that lingered around the property. A drone hovered overhead, its camera capturing the mournful sight of the mansion and its surroundings. A place where whispers of forgotten lives seemed to settle into every shadow. Through skeletal tree branches, the last of autumn's leaves fluttered to the ground, swept by the winds that seemed to carry with them an eerie presence. The camera slowed its descent, focusing on a small weathered sign, almost overtaken by ivy. Winslow House for Children, Est 1897. A raven landed atop the sign, its dark eyes meeting the lens before it took flight, its wings beating the air like the mournful cry of a forgotten soul. The camera shifted to focus on the mansion's broken windows, eyes that once welcomed visitors now turned inward, their empty frames seeming to watch in silence. A gentle but unnerving voice began to speak, the narrator's tone soft, yet laced with a subtle unease that perfectly mirrored the grim visuals unfolding.
"The story of the Winslow family," the voice began, "is like many tales from America's Gilded Age, a family of industrialists who, flush with the riches of the railroad boom, decided to give back to society by providing homes for the nation's most vulnerable children. It began with charity, but beneath that charitable veneer lies one of the most disturbing and unsolved mysteries of the early 20th century, a mystery that would remain hidden for more than a century, like the very children it ensnared." The camera panned across sepia-toned photographs, their edges worn with time, showing a distinguished family standing on the steps of a grand mansion. At the center, a tall man with a thick mustache stood upright, his posture rigid and commanding. His hand rested possessively on the shoulder of a woman seated before him. She was beautiful, her high cheekbones and clear eyes hiding secrets too heavy to be told. A mouth, slightly twisted, never quite matching the expected demure smile of the time. The children, dressed in stiff, formal attire, stood around them like pieces on a chessboard, their eyes vacant, controlled by invisible hands. "Theodore Winslow, the patriarch," the narrator continued, "built his wealth in the steel and railway industries during America's rapid industrialization. Born in 1855 to humble means, Theodore's rise to power was a story of both fortune and ruthless ambition. In the economic panic of 1873, while other investors faltered, he seized the opportunity to acquire struggling steel mills at a fraction of their worth. As the country recovered, his holdings positioned him to dominate the railway boom that transformed America. The scene shifted to vintage footage of steam locomotives churning across vast landscapes, workers laying tracks as symbols of America's expansion. By 1895, Theodore Winslow was one of the wealthiest men in New England, his personal fortune worth billions in today's dollars. He had climbed from nothing to join the ranks of the wealthiest in the nation, men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. The new aristocracy of America, not born into wealth but made through industry and ambition. The camera then moved to a portrait of Eleanor Winslow, Theodore's wife, a woman whose quiet beauty stood in stark contrast to the horrors she would later help orchestrate. She stared into the lens with an unsettling intensity, her gaze piercing, demanding the viewer's attention. She was not like the other women of her time. Her intellect and interests set her apart from the elite. Born Eleanor Blackwood, She was the last heir to one of Boston's oldest families, a lineage that traced its roots back to the Mayflower. But, unlike her husband's booming fortune, her family's wealth had faded over the generations. Their marriage in 1879 was one of convenience, an American union between old-world prestige and new-world wealth. As Theodore built his empire, Eleanor became known for her intellectual curiosity, particularly in the emerging sciences of human development and heredity. The camera zoomed in on her portrait, her gaze unrelenting, almost as if challenging the viewer to understand the depths of her mind. She didn't look monstrous, but perhaps that was the most terrifying part. What followed was a legacy of unparalleled scale. The screen flickered to show a map of the northeastern United States, with pins appearing one by one as the Winslow Charitable Foundation established orphanages across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. From Maine to Maryland, over the next 15 years, 12 orphanages would be built, each one a monument to the Winslow family's so-called philanthropy. But beneath their grand facades, something far darker was taking place. The Winslow name became synonymous with progress and care for orphan children. Across New England, the Winslow orphanages were hailed as the epitome of philanthropy, a perfect contrast to the underfunded, overcrowded institutions that defined most orphanages of the era. These homes were bastions of hope for children abandoned by circumstances beyond their control. Yet as the foundation's influence spread, so did an insidious truth lurking in the shadows of these institutions. The camera showed architectural renderings of the grand buildings rising from the soil, each one imposing and pristine. Workers swarmed across scaffolding, constructing each facility with lavish attention to detail. These institutions were palatial in comparison to the norm. Private rooms, electric lighting, modern plumbing, and educational facilities on par with the finest private schools. The Winslows spared no expense, and as the camera zoomed out to show a wide shot of the sprawling estates, it became clear. These orphanages were designed to impress the public. The Winslow orphanages, the voice of the narrator continued, were not merely charity. They were carefully crafted public relations machines, showcasing an idealized version of social care. Theodore Winslow understood that the image of a benevolent family giving back to society would elevate his legacy. And so, the Winslows turned their orphanages into a spectacle, a symbol of their moral superiority. Newspaper headlines flashed on the screen. Winslow opens 6th home for orphaned children. Millionaire's charity transforms the lives of the vulnerable. These glowing headlines, written with reverence, painted the Winslows as America's angels of mercy, beloved by the public and heralded by the press. But lurking behind the shimmering surface of these well-publicized facilities was a very different reality. Dr. Amelia Richardson, an expert in American social welfare, appeared on screen, her face serious, as she explained the context of the Winslows' philanthropic endeavors. In an era without child labor laws or any real regulation of orphanages, many institutions were little more than workhouses for children. Mortality rates were staggeringly high due to disease, malnutrition, and neglect. But the Winslow homes were different. They were praised as havens for children in need, providing healthy food, education, and modern comforts. The contrast with the overcrowded and underfunded state orphanages of the time couldn't have been starker. The Winslows were the gold standard, and their homes became the model for others to follow. The media hailed them as trailblazers, and the Winslow name became a byword for excellence in child welfare. But despite this overwhelming success, an unnerving truth was emerging. A pattern began to unfold, a pattern so disturbing it would take decades to uncover. Between 1897 and 1912, over 3,000 children passed through the doors of the Winslow orphanages. They were children from all walks of life, orphans of industrial accidents, disease, poverty, immigrant children whose families had perished during their journey to America, and children surrendered by desperate parents during times of economic hardship. Each child was carefully documented, photographed, and their personal details meticulously recorded. The intake photos of these children filled the screen. Solemn, silent faces staring back at the camera, each one with a number pinned to their clothes. But there's something chilling about these faces. The narrator's voice dropped to a whisper. Of the 3,000 children who entered these homes, not one can be definitively traced after their arrival. The screen froze on the faces of the children, their eyes full of uncertainty, fear, and resignation. Slowly, one by one, the photos faded to black, leaving only an empty void where they once existed. No adoption records, no death certificates, no census entries. Nothing. It was as though these children had never existed at all. The camera shifted to Dr. Margaret Holbrook, a historian and author of America's Missing, the Winslow Orphanage Mystery. She sat in a cozy living room, surrounded by books and papers. Her silver hair framed her face, lined with age, but animated by an intensity that matched the depth of her research. The scope of this disappearance is what makes it so extraordinary, Dr. Holbrook explained, leaning forward with urgency. We're not talking about a few missing records. We're talking about thousands of children who entered the Winslow system and then simply vanished from the historical record. It's as if they were erased from history, and no one noticed. Camera zoomed in on Dr. Holbrook's hands as she picked up a photograph of a young boy. His name was Robert Campbell, and he had been admitted to the Winslow home in Portland, Maine, in 1902. Orphaned by a factory fire, Robert had been described as healthy, well-behaved, and of above-average intelligence. Yet, just 6 months after his intake, Robert's records indicated he was transferred to another facility for specialized education. But no such transfer could ever be verified. Robert Campbell, like so many others, vanished without a trace. Dr. Holbrook picked up another photograph. A teenage girl named Catherine Donnow, admitted in 1905 after her parents succumbed to tuberculosis. Catherine was described as exceptionally intelligent and suited for advanced studies. She disappeared without a trace just 8 weeks after her admission. Each photograph in Dr. Holbrook's collection told the same story. A child, full of potential, entering the Winslow system, and then nothing. The camera then shifted to James Porter, a historian at the Millfield Historical Society. "What makes this case so frustrating," James said, as he carefully turned the pages of leather-bound records, "is the meticulous detail in which each child's entry was documented. Heights, weights, vaccination records, even cranial measurements. These weren't just social welfare records, they were scientific records. But then, nothing. No outcomes. No final records." As the camera zoomed in on the well-maintained records, it became clear. Every child had been tracked with unsettling precision. But once they entered the system, once their lives had been cataloged, they vanished. Their records stopped. as if their lives had simply ceased to matter. The camera shifted to a woman seated at a computer surrounded by photographs of her family. This was Catherine Reeves, a genealogist who had begun researching her great-grandfather's history. She discovered that her great-grandfather, William Reeves, had been placed in the Winslow home in Philadelphia in 1903 at the age of 7. But like the others, no records could be found for him after his admission. "I just wanted to know what happened to him," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never expected to uncover something like this. Every child who went into those homes disappeared from the records. It's as if they never existed." Catherine's search for answers led her to uncover a disturbing pattern across all 12 Winslow institutions. From Maine to Maryland, the same story played out. Children entered the system, documented meticulously, and then vanished. As Catherine Reeves continued her investigation, she connected with other genealogists and historians, uncovering a shared pattern of disappearances from all 12 Winslow orphanages. The haunting mystery began to take shape across multiple states, like a dark thread running through the fabric of New England and the Mid-Atlantic. The narrator's voice grew heavier as the camera showed maps and photographs of each orphanage location, spanning from Maine to Maryland. Pins marked each institution, one after the other, with each one holding the secrets of hundreds of lost children. The dark reality of the Winslow legacy began to unravel. The Winslow family, with their vast wealth and seemingly philanthropic motives, had created a network of orphanages that catered to children from all walks of life. Orphans from industrial accidents, disease, poverty, and even immigrant children who had lost their parents on the perilous journey to America. To the outside world, the Winslows were paragons of charity and benevolence, building grand homes for these children, providing them with what seemed like the best care money could buy. But beneath that glossy exterior, something insidious was at play. A flashback to the early 1900s showed Theodore Winslow, the patriarch of the family, standing tall and proud in formal portraits. His strong posture and stern expression reflected his drive for success. Theodore was a man who had turned his steel and railroad fortune into a colossal empire. But as much as he built his wealth, his dark obsession with control and power began to cast long shadows over his family's charitable endeavors. His wife, Eleanor Winslow, the former Eleanor Blackwood, was not just a figurehead of society's elite. She had a deep and unsettling interest in the emerging sciences of human development and heredity. The camera zoomed in on photographs of Eleanor at scientific lectures and medical demonstrations. She was known for her intellectual curiosity, something rare among the upper class of the time. But it was this fascination with the new sciences, paired with the Winslows' increasing wealth, that led to their monstrous plans. Eleanor, with her intense gaze, looked into the camera, her face appearing to challenge the viewer to understand what drove her. It was her drive for scientific progress, or perhaps a more sinister desire to push the boundaries of human experimentation that seemed to lie behind the family's actions. Theodore and Eleanor Winslow were building something far darker than mere orphanages. The Winslow Charitable Foundation had set out to establish 12 orphanages across the northeastern United States. And the foundation's rise mirrored America's burgeoning industrial power. Each institution was built with care, each brick carefully placed to conceal the horrors that occurred within. But what had initially begun as an idealistic charitable endeavor became something far more disturbing. Each orphanage became a breeding ground for a silent, systematic operation that no one dared question. Dr. Amelia Richardson's voice cut in, explaining the era in which these orphanages were built. This was a time before child labor laws, a time when orphanages were rarely regulated. Children were treated like little more than labor resources, but the Winslows offered them an illusion of safety, health, and education, a heaven compared to the hellish conditions in most orphanages. While other orphanages were plagued with disease and neglect, the Winslow homes were celebrated as havens for children, funded by one of the wealthiest families in America. But this was the carefully constructed facade, built not just to protect children, but to conceal the dark truths from public view. Between 1897 and 1912, the Winslow orphanages took in over 3,000 children. But as the narrator's voice grew more somber, it was revealed that not a single one of these children could be traced after they entered the system. The camera froze on haunting photographs of the children, their faces ranging from fear and confusion to resignation and sadness. The screen darkened as the faces slowly faded away, one by one, as if they were being erased from history. No records exist of what happened to them, the narrator whispered. No adoption papers, no death certificates, no census entries. Nothing. The camera shifted to the present, where Dr. Margaret Holbrook sat surrounded by books and research materials in her living room. Dr. Holbrook had spent decades investigating the mysterious disappearances of these children. Her work had led her to uncover the terrible truth that had been hidden for over a century. "I've spent 30 years investigating missing children," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But nothing compares to the systematic disappearance of over 3,000 children from these institutions. This isn't just negligence. This is something far more deliberate." The screen displayed the photograph of Robert Campbell, a young boy admitted to the Winslow home in Portland, Maine in 1902. Orphaned by a fire, Robert was described as healthy, well-behaved, and intelligent, but within 6 months he vanished. No records of his transfer, no trace of his existence after that point. Like so many others, Robert Campbell was swallowed by the system, his life and memory erased. The camera zoomed out to show the rows of photos, each one representing a life that had disappeared. The faces of the children were haunting in their stillness, each one marked by the cold, indifferent lens of a photographer who, in hindsight, had captured the final traces of their existence. Dr. Holbrook replaced Robert's photograph with another, Catherine Donow, a teenage girl who had entered the orphanage in 1905. Her parents had died of tuberculosis, and Catherine was marked as exceptionally intelligent. But just 8 weeks later, she too vanished, like so many before her. Each photograph that Dr. Holbrook picked up represented another lost soul, another child who had passed through the Winslow system, only to fade into nothingness. The camera transitioned to James Porter, an archivist at the Millfield Historical Society, as he carefully handled old records. He spoke with a deep sense of frustration. "What makes this case so confounding is the sheer level of detail in the original documentation," he said, flipping through pages that documented each child's height, weight, and personal history. It was like they were collecting data, but then nothing. These children disappeared, and their documentation stopped. Porter's words hung heavy in the air. What were they tracking these children for? And why did their records abruptly cease once they entered the system? What dark purpose did the Winslows have in mind? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the Winslow orphanages weren't mere institutions for charity. They were part of something far darker, a system of human experimentation and exploitation that spanned decades. But it wasn't until a determined genealogist named Catherine Reeves began to trace her great-grandfather's history that the world would start to uncover the full scope of the horror. Catherine discovered that her great-grandfather, William Reeves, had entered the Winslow home in 1903, but vanished from all records shortly afterward. "I just wanted to know what happened to him," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea I would uncover something like this. The more I looked, the more I realized every child who entered those orphanages disappeared without a trace." Catherine's search led her to other genealogists, all uncovering the same disturbing pattern. Children entered the Winslow orphanages, and then their lives were erased. Their names, their families, their very existence, all vanished. The investigation deepened with each passing day, uncovering one horrifying discovery after another. The story of the Winslow orphanages, once seen as a model of philanthropy, was beginning to reveal a twisted network that spanned generations. The camera panned to historical photos of the Winslow family, their formal portraits revealing no hint of the grotesque reality lurking behind their wealth. Theodore and Eleanor Winslow, once celebrated for their apparent benevolence, had been orchestrating a system of unimaginable horrors. Their orphanages were nothing more than fronts for a much darker purpose. The money spent on the grand buildings and the public-facing charities was merely a cover for the experimentation and exploitation of the children who passed through their doors. Dr. Margaret Holbrook continued her investigation, documenting each new revelation with mounting dread. "I've been working on historical disappearances for over 30 years, she explained, her voice taut with frustration. But the scope of the Winslow case is like nothing I've encountered. These children didn't just vanish, they were deliberately erased." In 2015, following the publication of Dr. Holbrook's book, attention turned back to the Winslow orphanages. Detective Michael Torres, from Rhode Island's Cold Case Unit, took the case with grim determination. "What we found was disturbing," he stated, flipping through decades-old files that had never been seen by the public. "There's a pattern, a methodical removal of evidence, not just of children but also staff members. It's as if someone went to great lengths to make sure the truth never saw the light of day." For decades, there had been whispers of wrongdoing at the Winslow orphanages, but no one had ever dared to challenge the Winslow family's power and influence. Now, those whispers were becoming a terrifying reality, and the truth about what had happened to the children who disappeared was finally beginning to surface. Dr. Holbrook's research had led to a revelation so horrific it was almost impossible to comprehend. The Winslow orphanages were not institutions of care, but of human experimentation, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. They were systematically experimenting on these children, using them as living subjects for research into human development and organ transplants, long before the first organ transplants were even attempted. The camera cut to images of anatomical drawings and surgical instruments, some of which had been recovered from the remnants of the Winslow estate. These were not tools used for legitimate medical procedures, but instruments used to carry out barbaric experiments on vulnerable children. The excavation in Millfield, where the original Winslow orphanage had stood, had unearthed the grim remains of 47 individuals. Most of them were children, their bones marked by surgical incisions that suggested they had been subjected to procedures with no legitimate medical purpose. Some of these children showed evidence of organ removal, others of tissue being harvested in ways that could only be described as experimental.
This wasn't medical treatment,
Dr. Sarah Keller, a forensic anthropologist, explained as she examined the remains under a microscope. These children didn't die of natural causes. They were dissected, their organs removed, their bodies altered in ways no legitimate medical practice would ever justify. The discoveries continued as the team unearthed more graves, uncovering the remains of over 300 individuals, most of them children. And with each new set of remains, the horror deepened. These children, taken in by the Winslow orphanages, had been sacrificed, their lives stolen for a twisted, hidden agenda. Dr. Keller was visibly shaken as she explained the implications. The precision of these procedures, the careful dissection of organs, the removal of tissue, it's not just the work of a family with delusions of grandeur. It's the work of an organized system, a machine built to harvest and dispose of human lives. But what was the ultimate goal of the Winslow family? Why had they subjected so many children to such unspeakable suffering? Dr. William Foster, a historian of science and medicine, offered some insight. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of great medical discovery, but they were also a time of ethical ambiguity. There was a deep fascination with the human body, with the possibility of extending life and eradicating disease. The Winslows, particularly Theodore, had a deep interest in the medical sciences. They were among the first to explore the possibility of organ transplantation, though they did so under the guise of philanthropy. The camera showed the elegant buildings of the Winslow Institute for Advanced Biological Studies, established by Theodore Winslow in 1895. While the Winslows had publicly presented their orphanages as philanthropic endeavors, the Institute was the true heart of their dark ambitions. The Institute was a secretive research facility, Dr. Foster continued, and its work was never published in any scientific journals. Its researchers disappeared into obscurity once they joined the Institute. No one knew what they were really working on, until now. Dr. Holbrook's voice filled the room, her tone now heavy with certainty. The Winslow Institute was not just conducting research, they were experimenting on the children they had taken in. And not just for medical purposes, but for something far darker: human tissue harvesting. The children were subjects, not orphans. And when their usefulness had expired, they were discarded. The camera transitioned back to the present, where Detective Torres stood at the edge of a vast excavation site. "We've recovered the remains of over 300 people from this site alone," he said, his voice grim with the weight of the discovery. "And we've only excavated about 20% of the possible burial areas. The full extent of what happened here may never be fully known." The investigation continued to unfold, revealing more disturbing truths about the scope of the Winslow family's crimes. Ground-penetrating radar had led to the identification of burial sites on the Winslow estate, which had once been home to the orphanages. To date, the remains of 47 children had been discovered, each bearing evidence of surgical procedures that were anything but medical. "We've identified remains from children as young as 3 years old," Dr. Wright, a forensic archaeologist, said as he supervised the excavation. "These children were likely among the thousands who passed through the Winslow system. They were taken in, cared for, and then disappeared. But not without leaving behind the evidence of what was done to them." The camera showed the solemn faces of the researchers as they carefully documented the findings, each bone and artifact providing more clues about what had transpired behind the walls of the Winslow orphanages. The investigation was far from over,
but it was already clear that the Winslow legacy would be forever stained by the horrors that had taken place under the guise of charity. As the camera panned across the vast memorial site where the remains of the children had been buried in unmarked graves, the narrator's voice returned, final and resolute.
The story of the Winslow orphanages is a tale of wealth, power, and unthinkable abuse. It is a cautionary tale about what can happen when those who control the system believe they are above reproach. But, thanks to the efforts of historians, genealogists, and the tireless work of law enforcement, the truth has begun to emerge. The children who vanished are finally being found, and their stories, though horrific, will never be forgotten. The camera zoomed in on a candle being lit at the memorial site, its flickering flame a symbol of the hope that even in darkness, the truth can find its way to the surface, and the search for justice continues.